Hello and welcome to another episode of Cooking with Colbath. Again, my name is Julie Colbath. I am the coordinator of Civic Engagement here at UM-Dearborn. Thanks so much for joining us. I feel like we're getting close to 20 episodes, which is crazy because it started sort of as a nugget of an idea at the beginning of quarantine. And here we are like 8 months later. So today we will be making a quick soup, which I'm excited about. I think I mentioned last time I'm a very big soup fan. I'm going to try my best to not just be making a bunch of soups because I feel like they're very comforting to me in winter. So the recipe that I've posted, I'm going to be making half of that recipe. It said that it makes 10 servings, and knowing that I'm going to be eating this by myself, I'm just gonna do half of it, right, just to make sure. I've never used this recipe before. It had like 4,000 reviews and, over 4 stars, which, as we know, reviews aren't always trustworthy, but hopefully with that many people, seems like it might be a good recipe, and it will be pretty quick. Part of that is because, the recipe seems quick in general, right? It says prep time, 20 minutes, which I think that's mostly like cutting your vegetables. So I don't really know. They might include sauteing the veggies in there too. I don't know. Cook time, 30 minutes. Total time, 50 minutes. Which, that's a little bit longer. It won't take us that long. But it's kind of hands-off, right? The most active thing that you'll be doing is cutting vegetables and sauteing them, and then it's more or less like throwing everything in the pot and letting it simmer. So one reason that this will take less time for me, and this was part of it's starting to be the holidays, and I'm kind of like trying to clean out my cupboard since it's the end of the year, and so I was like, oh, I just made pasta yesterday for dinner, so I already have some cooked pasta. So this will cut down a little bit of time because I don't need that to cook. So that'll save us about 10 minutes. So what we're going to be using today, we're making minestrone soup, which this is, if you've been to Olive Garden and had like the soup salad and breadsticks or just the soup in general, I think it's this normally popular one. So this says it's an Olive Garden copycat. We'll see if that's true. So minestrone, I think, is pretty forgiving, and I think, it started off as a soup that was kind of like utilize all the vegetables that are in your fridge that you need to get rid of, right? So I'm going to be making one substitution on my end. So it calls for carrots. It says 1 medium carrot. This is, right, I feel like size of vegetables can be super varying. I don't have, whole carrots at the moment. So I'm just using like 6 baby carrots. I feel like that's about a medium carrot. It calls for a small zucchini. Zucchini is something that I normally have on hand, but I do have a carton of spinach. So I'm going to be adding spinach instead. It calls for 1/4 of a large onion. We've already cut onions many times on the show, so it'll be pretty quick. And then it calls for celery. So we have some sticks of celery. All right, cool. And it also calls for garlic. Probably looks gross in my bowl. Like I've mentioned before, I don't always have fresh garlic. I get the little jars of minced garlic because they're a lot easier and quicker to use. But you can use granulated garlic, right, or the spice if you want. You just need to look up how much like a clove of garlic is dried garlic. Okay, and then we're going to use a can of diced tomatoes, 2 cups of vegetable broth, right, or you can use chicken broth, beef broth, whatever you want. So it calls for 1 can of northern beans and 1 can of kidney beans in the normal recipe. Since I'm cutting it in half, I'm only adding 1 can of beans, and I'm just going to add 1 can of kidney beans. I've already rinsed and drained and rinsed them. And then calls for dried basil and Italian seasoning, noodles, which we already showed, right? And we'll use some oil just to saute the veggies, right? So I think the most time-consuming part will be cutting our veggies, which won't take that long, and then sauteing them. So let me get you oriented on my little station. Okay, cool. So I don't know if I've shown this. Sorry, there was a phone call. Which I don't know if you heard that in the speakers or not. So this is what I normally have is like, right, I think I've had the bouillon powder, and this is like a paste sort of. So this is what I normally use, so I don't have a bunch of cans of broth, but if you do have cans, you're welcome to use that, or you can use this. All right, cool. So we're just gonna do everything on our cutting board now. So I'm gonna cut this onion quick. We've cut them a million times, right? So I'm just gonna dice it by making cuts one way and then making cuts 90 degrees the other way. And if you have any, like these pieces didn't really get cut very well, so you can just, quickly cut them into smaller pieces. So we'll move those over to the side. It doesn't, we don't need to keep this stuff separate because it'll all end up in our pot to saute. All right. So we have these baby carrots. So I'm just gonna we'll just do one to show you. And I'm just gonna keep them in their whole form and just cut them into thin circles. So probably, I don't know how well you can see that. You could also cut the carrot in half, right? So then you create a flat edge, and then you'll just kind of have half moon shapes doing a similar, similar slice that way. So you can do it either way. Normally I'll cut a couple at a time. It's just sort of a matter of preference on I don't know, sometimes when you are eating something, people are different about textures or the size of things when they try to bite into a certain, vegetable. So if you want them smaller, you can make them smaller. If you want them the size, you can make them the size. All right, so I've got our onions and our carrots. We're gonna use our celery. So I don't normally, when it starts to get really white on the bottom, I don't really use that part. So I'm just gonna cut the bottoms off. And you can cut I already had trimmed the tops. If there are a lot of leaves, you can pull them off or you can cut them off. I don't know what you can really do with celery leaves. I'm sure you can do something. So the way that I normally cut celery, depending on what size I want it to be, right, is I will cut my stalk of celery. I'll do a slice so that now I have 2 pieces. And so that it's a similar size to the onion. I'm going to cut the pieces in half again. And, you know, it's going to be a little bit variable, so don't worry if they're like not perfect. So I'm just sliding my knife through, and then I just bunch them together and then make like slices, those quick cuts like we were with the carrots. So sort of thin pieces to make sure that it cooks through relatively quickly. Right, celery is a pretty crunchy vegetable. So in order to soften and break down, it's easier for the pieces to be smaller. All right, and we'll just repeat that with our other 2 stalks of celery. Right, so cut it in half, cut the halves in half, and then just chop. Celery is a good thing to have on hand, right, even if you don't like eating it raw, just because it can bring a lot of flavors, especially to like soups and other dishes, right? Sometimes when people are making like roasts and stuff, celery can add a nice flavor. All right, so on our last stop, again, cut it in half, cut it in half again, and then just slice. If you wanted to not cut it at all, right, like if you make thin slices of the whole celery, so it's sort of like little like crescent moons, you could easily do that. They would just be a bigger chunk of vegetable to bite into. Seems like quite a bit of celery, but what do I know? One thing, so I always think it's, you know, it's nice to read reviews to get different ideas of what to expect. So we'll just start sauteing this. So I'm going to turn my pan on. I am using a pot so that we can just add everything to the pot. So I'm just adding some oil, and I'll adjust the camera in a second. I'm going to let that heat for a second. So what I was saying is reading reviews can be helpful, right? Like I made something the other day that people were like, too spicy, you know, cut in. Like I would recommend cutting the spice in half. I did that and it was still very spicy. So this recipe, there were people who had said if you add the dry noodles and let it cook, sometimes that can absorb too much liquid in the soup. So there is something on the ingredients list about adding more water if it gets to be a thicker soup than you would like. But people were suggesting to cook the noodles on the side and then add them in afterwards so that you don't have to worry about your noodles absorbing all of your liquid. Cool. I'm going to add the vegetables to our pot. Trying not to get any in my stove. All right. I'm just going to use a spoon to mix the veggies around, get them covered in a little bit of oil. So, hold on one sec. If I were using zucchini, I would add it here. Since I am not, and if you've ever cooked with spinach, you might know that you feel like you add what seems like a forest of spinach, and it ends up being like one tree by the time it cooks down. So I'm going to wait to add spinach until my last, like one of the last steps, right? Because it won't take that long for it to wilt and cook down. So we'll add that towards the end, right? But if you were substituting the zucchini, say, with peppers or broccoli, you would add it now so that it has time to saute. I think too, with beans, right? I feel like minestrone soup, you oftentimes see kidney beans in there. But I feel like you could, right, so this calls for northern beans and kidney beans. Northern beans are like a white bean, so you could substitute it with almost anything, right? Like cannellini beans, garbanzo beans, whatever you have on hand, right? If I were making this whole recipe instead of halving it, I would have added garbanzo beans because I don't have northern beans in my cupboard at the moment. You can also swap out either of them for black beans or pinto beans. Beans can be pretty interchangeable, I think, at least. I don't know about y'all, but I love the smell of sauteing veggies, especially things like onions. It just is very nice. Some things to note about the pantry this week. We have some adjusted hours because we will be closed during the break. So we'll be closed from December 23rd to January 5th. So please make sure you plan accordingly, right, if you normally visit the pantry. So this week we're open tomorrow, which is Wednesday, from 12 to 6. On Thursday, we're open from 10 to 5, and on Friday, we're open from 2 to 5. And then next Tuesday, which would be the 22nd, we'll be open from 10 to 6. So make sure if you want to make an appointment that you email UM-Dearborn Pantry at umich.edu by 5 p.m. the day before you want your appointment. This just gives us time, right, to make sure that we get all the relevant information from you, to you, and from you, right? So we'll have you fill out an order form that lets us know what you're looking for so that when we pack a bag for you, we're giving you the things that you are looking for, right? So make sure you email, and then if you visit our website, so if you go to umdearborn.edu/pantry, that should take you straight to the Student Food Pantry website. There should be a link for other pantries near you, so you can type in your zip code and find other pantries near you, which is helpful, especially if you don't. Really, a lot of our materials are more focused on the Metro Detroit area, but if you don't live in that area, that's not helpful for you. So you can type in your zip code and see what other pantries there are, and contact them if their hours aren't listed so that you know other places to get food over the break. We're getting a nice sizzle. So just trying to make sure that like it's a pretty even layer of veggies so that they cook more evenly, right? Like if you have a bunch of like piles, not like the stuff that's on the top isn't gonna cook. So if you have any input we are seeking input on things you might want to see in the pantry and or our winter hours, right? So feel free to visit our social media websites. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Office of Student Life sites for a survey if you have input on what hours you'd like for us to be open next semester. It will continue to be by appointment only, so please note that, and it'll be curbside pickup until further notice. I think this will be the longest step that we'll really need. So, because it says about 10 minutes or until the veggies are tender. I think that's what it says. Zucchini normally cooks pretty quickly. I wouldn't add time to this because zucchini is like a softer vegetable. So saute about 10 minutes or until vegetables soften. But once that's done, then we'll add our diced tomatoes and our seasonings. And then we'll throw everything else in. And then I think we're just going to simmer it, right? So normally, like I mentioned, you would add the broth, the dry noodles, the beans, and you would simmer it for 10 minutes. And this more or less allows the noodles to cook, but we're adding cooked noodles already. So I'm going to skip that step. I'm going to just add all this up plus the garlic, and then I'm just going to let it simmer for about 10 minutes. You can let it simmer longer if you want it to have a stronger flavor. I'll add the spinach too. We ought to be getting pretty close. Starting to see a little bit of browning on some of our veggies. I'm going to grab a fork so I can poke the veggies to see how tender they are. So our onions are pretty tender. Celery is pretty tender. And our carrots are pretty tender too. Generally, as like if you were to let this simmer for a while, and there are lots of versions of minestrone soup, right? So there might be other options if you prefer like slow cooker or pressure cooker. But as it simmers, the vegetables will soften a little bit too, as they might absorb some liquid. If you ever feel like your soup becomes too liquidy, you can try to just like have it uncovered and simmer it for a while to help evaporate some liquid. Or you could add more of something, right? If you wanted more beans or more veggies, just make sure, right? If you felt like it doesn't have enough veggies, make sure to saute them on the side before you throw them in so that you don't have, these nicely tender veggies and then like a crunchy piece of carrot. All right. So we're going to add our diced tomatoes and our seasonings. My tomatoes are right here. So we're going to add the whole can. We're not going to drain it. We want the tomato flavor. My pan's a little hot. White was probably, or off-white was not the best choice to wear today. Alright, so our tomatoes are added. This again is dried basil and dried Italian seasoning. If you had fresh basil, you could easily add that. one thing to note, right, and this was something that I had thought about if I was making the whole recipe, because I only had 1 can of diced tomatoes, and of normal diced tomatoes. Okay, so then another can of diced tomatoes with green chilies, and if you're gonna use that, just be ready that like it might have a little bit of spice. But those cans are normally a little bit smaller. Those cans are normally about 10.5 ounces maybe, whereas normal diced tomato cans are 14. So you could always add like additional tomatoes if you have tomatoes on hand. We do have tomatoes in the pantry at the moment, which is really exciting. Okay, so we're adding some vegetable broth. We also have pineapples and onions. So some exciting fresh produce. So since I used like that bouillon base like I showed you, you can see there's some like residual stuff on my measuring cup. So I'm going to put that in right because that's a lot of the seasoning. All right. Okay. And then we're going to add the beans. And it didn't necessarily say to drain and rinse them. I felt like that was a tiny bit vague. So you could not drain them if you didn't want to. I just didn't want the extra liquid, to be honest. Just because I know, right, that my noodles won't really absorb liquid, so I didn't want it to be too thin of a soup. But if you want to not drain them, doesn't seem like you have to. Okay, and then I'm gonna add my noodles. So there are some people who felt, well, there were a couple of reviews that said that the ratio of like noodles to vegetables was off. So if you feel like you want more noodles, add more, see what happens. Okay, let's see. Broth, noodles, beans, simmer for 10 minutes. And again, that was to cook the noodles. So we're not going to do that. So we're just going to go straight to adding our minced garlic. I don't want to touch it with my hands. Okay. So we're going to let that sit. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear when my phone rings on my computer. So we added the garlic and we're just going to let it simmer for 10 minutes. And once that's done, we'll be done, right? And so let me just show you. I mean, it's not going to look very good from above, but I can show you what it looks like. Let me try to like spoon a little bit of the soup so you can see all of the veggies and the pasta. Woo! My hand isn't very strong, apparently. So, pretty simple recipe, right? We did that in less than 30 minutes. It'll take a little bit longer if you are using uncooked pasta, which a lot of the recipes on the internet call for, which, you know, makes sense. It's one less step. But just be aware that sometimes pasta can take up a lot of liquid. So your soup might end up a little bit thicker than you would like. You can always thin it out with water or whatever broth you're using. Or you could always, it depends, right? If you were trying to use like tomato sauce or something, you know, might change the flavor just a tiny bit. But the nice things with soups is that they can be pretty flexible and pretty forgiving. sometimes I just throw a bunch of things together and hope that it works out. So if you have a favorite soup recipe, please feel free to drop it in the comments or the live chat that's happening as this is airing. In a few minutes, I'm going to just throw the spinach in there. If you are adding kale, you would want to put it in sooner, just because kale is a little bit, takes longer to cook down, I think, than spinach. Kale's a little bit more fibrous. So I hope that you try it and you like it, especially if you are a minestrone fan. And right, like I mentioned, the nice thing about this recipe is that, or seemingly minestrone soup in general, is that you can kind of adapt it to whatever vegetables you have on hand. You could easily use frozen vegetables. I saw some recipes that had green beans, so if you could throw a can of green beans in there in place of some of these other veggies. So pretty adaptable, pretty forgiving. If you make it, let me know if you have any suggestions of other things that we should do on the show. I love recipe suggestions. We will be taking a break and we'll resume in the new year. So gives you some time to think about, what would you like to see on the show? If you have any feedback, let us know. And again, if you want to utilize the pantry, feel free to email UM-Dearborn pantry at umich.edu, and just know that that email won't be monitored over the break while we are gone. Thanks again for joining. Good luck with the end of the semester, and we will see you in the new year.